Okay, so my name's Austin, and this is my final video in the series on why I love the novel Infinite Jest. In the world of philosophy, there's a field called ontology, which is the study of existence. It deals with questions like what does it mean to exist, or what does it mean to be? One of the most fundamental questions in this field is what exists, with the stereotypical example being, does a God exist? Something I think is interesting about this question is that there can be a difference in the status of existence between an object and the concept of that object, right? One can exist when the other doesn't. A simple example of this is unicorns, where I think most people believe unicorns aren't real, but at the same time, if I say that word and an image appears in a person's head of a horse with a horn, then even if unicorns themselves don't exist, the concept of them does. The opposite of this can also be true, where an object exists even if no human being has a concept of this. Atoms and molecules existed far before any human being had an understanding of them. Within this class of objects, those that exist even if humanity doesn't have a concept of them, the one I find most fascinating throughout human history is addiction. While addiction is something that has a fairly widespread understanding today, humanity's current concept of addiction really hasn't even been around for a century. It's less than 100 years old. And while this seems kind of absurd that something that feels as obvious as addiction does, that no one really put together a concept of this for so long, at the same time, I don't think I would have understood it on my own either. If no one had explained to me what addiction was when I was a kid, and I hadn't heard about it through multiple sources, then if someone came up to me and said, I need help, I can't stop drinking, I would be like, what do you mean you can't stop drinking? Just put the bottle down. Right? It takes 100% less effort to keep the bottle on the table than it does to pick it up and drink out of it. And, even if you can't stop drinking once you start, then just don't buy another bottle. Like, what is this? If someone came up to me and said, I can't stop drinking, then it would seem insane, right? I don't think I would have put together the concept of addiction on my own. Going back to Infinite Jest itself, there's a part of the book where Hal and Pemulus get their hands on an incredibly potent fictional hallucinogen. And they're having a hard time figuring out what dose they should take of it. Where they don't want to go too low because they have a limited supply and it's almost impossible to get more. So they don't want to waste any of it. But they don't want to go too high because of why it's so hard to obtain the drug in the first place. Within the world of the novel, the army was testing this fictional drug on fictional soldiers, and when they gave one of the soldiers too high of a dose, from that point on through the end of his life, the only thing he ever did was sing show tunes. And they had to eventually put him in a cell in Fort Leavenworth, and no matter how many doctors or psychologists they brought in to observe him, nobody could change what he was doing, and for the rest of his life, the only thing he did was sing show tunes. A bit later in the book, Hal has a dream where he is the soldier in the cell in Fort Leavenworth, and he is saying, "Help me, please help me, I need help," over and over again. But no matter how many times he says it, and no matter how he tries to phrase it, all of the people in the cell with him, all of the doctors and psychologists, are just standing there, tapping their feet and snapping their fingers, as if all he is doing is singing show tunes. This dream, where Hal is saying, "Please help me," and the only responses he gets are tapping feet and snapping fingers, is what I have to imagine it was like being an alcoholic maybe in the year 1600, where no matter how many people you went to and said, "I need help, I can't stop drinking," the responses that you get, it seems like you might as well just be singing show tunes to them. No matter how many times you said, I need help, I can't stop drinking," and people are like, "What do you mean you can't stop drinking? Just put the bottle down," right? These responses are about as useful as people tapping their feet and snapping their fingers, and their responses show that they are hearing what you're saying about as much as the people who are only hearing show tunes. A little bit later, as Hal is describing this dream to Pemulus, he refers to it as horrifying. And when Pemulus responds and calls it a nightmare, Hal corrects him and he says, "No, it wasn't a nightmare. The fundamental emotion of the dream wasn't fear. It was loneliness." And once again, I have to think this is what it was like being an alcoholic 300 years ago, where even if you manage to find a way to get sober by yourself, you would still have these moments where, someone would invite you over for a glass of wine and you say, "No, I can't drink. Once I start, I can't stop." They might respond by saying, "You haven't had a drink in years. Clearly you have this under control." And these responses would probably generate a sense of loneliness, because what they indicate isn't so much that the person doesn't believe you. It's that they believe your life doesn't exist. And so the question becomes, if it took humanity hundreds, if not thousands of years to figure out something that seems as obvious now as addiction does, isn't it possible that there are people out there now who have an incredible internal experience that they can't explain to anyone because the concept of it doesn't currently exist? Walking around a world that hasn't invented a word for your experience is a curse I would wish on no one. And for a long time, the most important lesson I taught myself was, if I were in a situation where no matter what I said, people only heard show tunes, I would start singing show tunes, because then I could pretend the response was real. In the last video, I talked about the story of Barry Loach and how he became the head trainer at ETA, where it started with a challenge where he had to go out by Boston Metro Station while doing his best to look homeless and holding out his hand and saying, "Please touch me," where the only thing he had to do was get one human being to touch him, to get one person to care. And once he started asking this, and no one touched him. I mean, people would give him money, but nobody would supply him with the thing he was asking for. Nobody would interpret what he was trying to tell them in the simplest way possible. He found himself in a cycle where once he would ask for someone to touch him and he would get rejected, then when he became denied of human empathy, he felt the need to ask for it again because he needed it to come out of the, hurt of being rejected. And so he found himself in a cycle where he would ask for someone to touch him, get rejected, feel a need for human empathy, which could only be resolved by asking again. And when the next person rejected him, he would feel even worse, which made him need human empathy more. And he worked himself further and further into this hole where he functionally became homeless himself because the only thing he could do was continue to stand out there and ask for someone to touch him because he just needed that empathy so bad. And in the story, within the novel, Barry Loach gets out of his situation when Mario, at the age of 14, with no worldly experience, comes across him by himself. Mario's on his own. When he asks, "Please touch me," Mario gladly shakes his hand. Barry Loach, interestingly enough, did have another option here, where instead of waiting and waiting and waiting for someone who has no worldly understanding to come around and talk to him, at any point he could have chosen to just go home. But this is something that no matter how bad it feels to get rejected at any individual time, the choice to go home immediately is far worse. Because in order to do that, you have to accept that you're completely alone. And as hard as this is a decision that can eventually be made. And this decision is discussed throughout Infinite Jest in multiple ways, most notably through the idea of the gift of desperation, where no matter how terrible that solution to your problem seems, it can't possibly be worse than what you are going through now. If you can just find a way to get past that initial discomfort, it can't possibly be worse than standing out there day after day after day asking for someone to touch you. The thing is, if a person does choose the route of going home and does choose to accept that they are alone, then after some time, things can get better. And you can go and find a way to, go about your life in a way where you can still find joy in it. And it can be better than the process of standing outside and asking person after person to touch you. It can get better than that. But no matter what, there will still be moments where that loneliness does come back in. And for a person in that situation, even if there's no one they can talk to about what it is they're going through, if there was a book in which the author described their experiences completely, then in the moments of loneliness they could go back to this novel and feel some kind of human connection. And for a person in this situation, this novel that describes their experiences would likely become very important to them. And I just want to close this series by saying I love the novel Infinite Jest. Anyways, that's all.